Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Another happy birthday, Josh. And some people I know have sent you birthday wishes, and I would encourage others to do so.
Well, now they get their chance.
Josh's birthday we're recording Tuesday. Josh's birthday was Monday, so sounds like you had a passable birthday weekend.
Yeah, I mean, you get to a certain age. It's a Monday birthday.
Yeah. What are you going to do?
The world goes on.
Right. The great world spins. So in addition to Josh's birthday, well, kind of a lot going on. So, off the top of my head, or, right at the outset, nationally, Donald Trump's federal indictment, his court appearance, as we're recording this, scheduled for later today, swamping most everything else in terms of coverage. And, and not everything, but obviously, other things that have been happening that are interesting even at the national level that I think, we've talked about this. Maybe we'll be able to link it all together. We'll see, without being here for an hour and a half. In terms of national politics, there's also been, this kind of implosion of the Republican caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives. Last week, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy had to basically send everybody home because his critics on the far right were voting against all of the rules that were coming out of the Rules Committee for some legislation that was planned, essentially in protest over the debt ceiling deal. Now, as I read, at least as of this morning, some of that seems to have been at least temporarily ameliorated. Most of the, the insidery coverage from D.C. suggests this is a Band-Aid, not a solution or a resolution.
Yeah,
that makes sense to me.
It's a repeated game, and we talk about that sort of idea a lot here. But I mean, to the extent that, the far-right caucus, both in the U.S. House and also in the Texas House, has, sort of, let's just say, played the game multiple times. They're getting better at extracting concessions, and the razor-thin majority that Republicans have in the House only makes it easier for them.
Right.
And so that's kind of what we're watching play out now. And to your point, I think is right, which is, this is, any sort of deal that they get to now to kind of move forward in terms of, kind of getting to some sort of regular order of business in the Congress and passing legislation and stuff is like, it's just going to last as long as it does until the next time.
Some of the spokespeople for, the sort of anti or McCarthy skeptical, shall we say, forces in the House are saying, that, having felt burned by the debt deal and the lack of reduction in spending that they say they want to renegotiate the deal, which de facto they are already doing.
Right.
But I think that, policy-wise, that could actually plunge us back into more instability at the national level when it comes to actually passing budget bills, because much of what they want is obviously dead in the U.S. Senate and not going to be signed by the White House.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just for a moment, even kind of looking back and you think about, Nancy Pelosi and her time sort of dealing with a majority and dealing with, sort of far left critics and everything. And, she took a lot of heat, but, to her credit, she was usually able, to get the vote she needed.
Yeah.
And I think,
and to not have to rely on Republicans.
And not have to rely on Republicans is a big deal. And, and I think, McCarthy already very early in his tenure showed he's probably going to have a much rougher road when it comes to this kind of work.
I think,
there's a bunch of articles like, I just love, just thinking back now, there are these articles like, what Kevin McCarthy loves? Counting votes.
Yeah.
It's like Kevin McCarthy, he loves the whip, he loves to count the votes. And it's like, yeah, I bet he loves counting those votes.
Yeah, I bet he's having a lot less fun doing that right now.
Right.
So I think, that there's going to be more bad news from that. So we'll keep an eye on that and maybe even circle back to both that end.
Yeah, we might have some interesting polling data, actually.
We will. And, of course, the Trump indictment. I mean, we'll circle back. But, Meanwhile, back in Texas, we're also seeing, as you've already kind of, sort of introduced, Texas level variation on some of these themes.
Right.
So in the Texas House, they remain gavelled out after having fast-tracked Governor Abbott's legislative priorities for the special session in the call, and then adjourned sine die on the first day of the new session. We talked a lot about that last week. We don't need to relitigate all of that, but this, in the interim since we recorded last Wednesday and today, has left the lieutenant governor to stew somewhat and stew publicly.
Yeah.
And cast aspersions on the speaker and on the governor and the Texas and meanwhile the Texas Senate, at least for the first few days, kind of surreally, to my mind, seemed to proceed as if everything was normal, at least on the floor. They debated bills, they discussed things, and it was kind of a strange spectacle. Now I think we're kind of past that. Over the weekend, a lot of speculation over just what the lieutenant governor's next move was going to be.
Yeah.
It's going to be a hit to his pride to just adjourn the Senate, sine die, and start over. But, it's also hard to keep people around doing nothing. Now, I think, they're not doing nothing in the sense that there's may or may not be negotiations going on. There's certainly a degree of public negotiation going on. But, as we said last week, I mean, and already things are beginning to point toward the next shuffling of allegiances among the big three. So both the governor and the speaker of the House in the last few days have pointed to another special session to come on education. Mm-hmm. The governor he's already reiterated his promise that there will be another special session on education with school choice /ESAs /vouchers on the call. Mm-hmm. And so that, that issue will be resurrected. On Monday, the speaker announced the formation of a House Select Committee on Educational Opportunity and Enrichment. I'm just scanning that to see if it has a snazzy abbreviation or acronym, but it does not.
That's unfortunate.
The SCIOE. As people look at the membership of that committee, it has a slight majority of anti-voucher members on the committee.
Kind of like the legislature as a whole.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you would say that, because I think that, and maybe we'll go back and do this later when they call the next, whenever this happens. But if you handicap the votes on that, the committee is actually probably more closely divided than the House as a whole is, or even the Republican Party as a whole. I mean, different people could parse this different ways, and there's some wild cards involved, but, it does look like it's really only a couple of vote majority.
Yeah.
And that's politically, I suspect, will say, hey, look, we didn't just stack it per se. Right? Yeah. So, and then we also saw kind of, I think this week, another interesting thing I think worth flagging, or this week and last week, since last week we podcasted, we saw what I think is an interesting kind of split screen bill signings for the governor that really illustrate some interesting dynamics in the party. So on your one screen, the governor, with some amount of fanfare, though not an incredible amount, but some, signed HB 900, which set new standards for school libraries to follow when adding books to their collections. So this is the other shoe dropping of the discussion we've been talking about for over a year of library books and materials deemed sexually explicit. The bill that was passed was, moderated, I think, from some of these initial conceptions, though I think if you're a kind of First Amendment advocate or, for a lot of people, it's still too much, but not what we were talking about, I don't think, in the very beginning. So, the Texas State Library and Archives Commission will, it has been given the responsibility to create mandatory material standards that then have to be approved by the State Board of Education. Authority's been granted to review book purchases and ratings, and then, in each district, and then you have to publish a list of vendors that don't comply with the rating requirements. So, there's definitely a lot more vetting going on here. And then school districts have to review the content each odd-numbered year, and then submit a report to the TEA, basically, a compliance check. with that first audit to occur no later than 2025. So that's one screen is
get those books out.
Right. Speaking to that, and it's, it's built under the rubric of parental rights and review.
Uh-huh.
And we have polling on that suggest that, at the end of the day, it's
not important to people. I mean, I'll just sort of, just to summarize this, when we go and we looked at sort of the things the legislature was considering that like generated a significant amount of, public ink, attention from legislators, attention from the public, these issues that people were talking about. Right. This was not something that was high on the list of like, what does the legislature need to accomplish?
The broad priorities.
Yeah, we say, when we look at this compared to a lot of other things, just for example, removing, potentially inappropriate books from the library doesn't rank as high as, say, fixing the grid, making sure there's water, school safety, even things like property tax reduction. There's just a lot of issues that are higher than this. And not only that, even the education space, when you look at this idea of, removing books, this is way, way down on the list relative to things like increasing teacher pay, and even to the point about under the broad rubric of like parental rights and insights, there's a lot more appetite for like parents gaining access to, instructional materials, let's say, for example, than there is towards removing books from libraries. Right. And so this has been something that, I think, it's interesting. I'll just say one more thing about it. We've been pulling on this for a while, and there is just sort of a natural, I would call it squeamishness to this idea of taking books out of libraries because, ultimately what it comes down to, and this is sort of what I think is interesting generally about a lot of these issues, is, the state isn't saying in a lot of cases, this is what has to happen. They're almost saying this is a rubric for what we expect to happen, and now we want the school districts to deal with it.
Right.
And I mean, I could repeat that kind of thing where we change out school district with something else, but there's a lot of this dynamic going on here where, it's not really that, again, the state has been saying, so, we can't have all these patchworks of things. But ultimately, in a lot of these cases where we're talking about community standards and things like that, you are actually inviting, different interpretations to kind of take place.
Well, it turns out in a big, diverse state like Texas, state's kind of a patchwork.
At least when it comes to the libraries. But yeah,
right.
No, exactly.
So, that was but that was very much a I don't want to say it's a sweet spot issue because it's not quite that. But, when we looked at some of the data on this wasn't generally polarized depending on how you framed it, right? So if you framed it as you were sort of implying, should parents be able to know what books their kids are checking out of a school library?
Sure.
Then Democrats are like, whatever. That's not so bad, right? So it is a bit of how you pitch it.
Well, I've been saying this. Somebody was asking me this weekend, about a couple weekends ago about Ron DeSantis and sort of pivoting in a weird direction, but this idea of running a national campaign on being anti-woke and whether that's like an effective strategy. And to me, it's not necessarily that that's an effective affirmative strategy. It's just that the response is so terrible. And that's kind of how this sort of stuff is. It's not that, there's a bunch of people out there in Texas clamoring to take a bunch of books out of the libraries or get specific books out of kids' hands. The problem is that if you're on the other side of that, and I've said this before, if you're a Democrat who doesn't want this to happen, you end up in the position of basically having someone read to you the most lurid passage from whatever book they find, saying, do you think a third grader should have access to this? And the answer is, well, I don't know. I guess not. I don't know. Who are their parents? I don't know. Or no, but this is the thing. Ultimately, that kind of squishiness in response to these things is just, it's not a good political spot to be in. Even if, the policy itself is kind of like people are like, well, does this matter? But the flip side of that is being on the defensive on these issues, I think is pretty challenging.
Yeah, I think that's right. So,
and that's why some Democrats voted for this bill. I mean, just notably, it was like 5 or 6.
No small numbers, I remember. I mean, not a huge number, but yeah. So on one screen, you've got delivering on the library books issue, quote unquote, with all the caveats about why, the extent to which it is an issue there. The other screen, and I kind of, I think I was traveling when this happened or, just otherwise preoccupied. Governor Abbott also signed the Texas CHIPS Act, and there's a U.S. CHIPS Act, but I think there's not a lot of discussion.
Not to be confused with the great show from
California. Yes, Paunch.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with Paunch, and I can't remember the other guy's name.
The blonde guy?
Yeah, the blonde guy. Larry Wilcox was the actor's name. That just popped in my head. But anyway. Enough free association for now. But last week, Greg Abbott signed the Texas CHIPS Act, which creates the Texas Semiconductor Innovation Fund, which is, a fair-sized pot of money over $1 billion, closer to 1.3 actually.
It'll help access federal funds and that kind of thing.
Right. Which subsidizes companies that manufacture chips in Texas and provides funds to universities and other entities to do research and work on chip design or manufacturing projects. In other words, it's an industrial policy.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what we used to call it. I don't think and so I underline this as the split screen because we've been going on for years, if not months, about the, competing imperatives and the competing constituencies inside the Republican Party. And we haven't done a big, sort of roundup on all this, but this was one of those pieces of legislation, not very controversial, discussed quite a bit, passed, I think, without too much pushback in both chambers. But, what can I say? It's a we've talked a lot about the Eco-Devo impulse, and it is, again, industrial policy pursued by the state. And, a not insignificant amount of money, again, some of which is going to business and some of which is going to higher ed research.
Well, again, what I mean, with this, you're bringing up this dichotomy, and I'll try to be a little bit more explicit, and then I'll bring up another example of this because it's interesting, right? Like on the one hand, you've got the legislature, and I'm just going to say it this way because I feel like it, trying to burn books, basically, right? But on the other hand, there's the reality of the fact that Texas is in this, in and of itself is in this very competitive economic environment that's not even just based in the U.S., but it's a worldwide competitive economic environment around something like chips, which, you think, I think I'm kind of laughing when you talk about it as industrial policy, obviously, because also, the people working, on these chips and, working in these places, this is not your standard industrial job.
Right.
These are pretty high-end jobs for the most part, and most of these people probably read a lot of books, went to college. The dynamic there of these sort of two things going on the one hand, like, well, can we like move back? Again, I'm just saying, standard sort of conservative policy direction. Can we take a step back? Can we slow down? The kids are seeing too much, whatever, on the one hand. On the other hand, we need to be at the forefront of the technology, that of the next at least 50, 100 years. It makes me think of, sort of the similar dynamic that was faced with the legislature's orientation towards higher education institutions, et cetera. A lot of people pointed out, which is on the one hand, you've got this desire, this priority, especially in the House, to invest big in Texas's public universities, put a bunch of money in there. The idea was we're going to do this in exchange for keeping tuition flat. And everybody was kind of on board with this.
And to spread the higher ed ecosystem and the resources within it to the schools that are not the current flagships.
Right.
In other words, beyond the A&M and the A&M and UT.
The biggest thing they accomplished this session was the way that they reformulated community college financing.
And also the formation of the TUF.
Right. So just setting this. So there's all this stuff going on the one hand to basically bolster Texas's higher education institutions, while at the same time, like, let's get rid of tenure.
Right.
Which would destroy Texas's higher education institution. I'm not saying that as some hysterical act. I don't really care. I don't have tenure. I'm never going to have tenure. Not my problem. But, ultimately, I do know from a market perspective, there would be a huge, you want to talk about immigration. There'd be an outflow.
Reverse migration.
Yeah, there'd be a pretty huge outflow of faculty, from all of Texas's top universities, basically, to anywhere else immediately. And so it's sort of like, there's...
And even the discussion, there are, reasonably, anecdotal, but reasonable, because they can't be that documented, but, a lot of evidence that it actually is already, the discussion even hurt recruiting.
Well, look, and I was thinking about this morning, we've
kind of stayed away from this.
No, and this is a more general observation, but it relates, which is, I was thinking this morning for something else I'm going to do later today about, people who claim they're going to move because of politics. And it's just one of those things. I'm not saying that there aren't situations where people move because of the politics of a place. And I mean, obviously in extreme conditions, for sure, right? When we're talking about immigration broadly, but we're talking about
trans kids.
Well, and we're talking about trans kids for sure. But we're talking about like your everyday politics, living life in the United States of America.
I'm tired of reading the newspapers about what's going on in my state or my country. Yeah.
The idea that people moving is some sort of like a broad-based actual political response. Like, you just got to stop and say, time out for a second. Like, what kind of a symbol of, let's just say, economic, freedom it is to even consider the idea of like picking up and moving from some place that you presumably own a home, you have a career, you have all these things. And you're just going to go like, well, I'm moving to Colorado. It's like, you're not, and just real quick, we're not talking about normal people here. We're talking about people who have the resources most times to like even consider something like this seriously.
Right.
You know who people like that are in some cases? Academics who could get university jobs somewhere else.
Right.
I mean, they have the ability to actually move in a market where it's common to move state to state, where it's common to take a job somewhere else, and where, again, they'll pay for your moving expenses.
And you may have to move down market, but,
But if you really want to,
you can.
You can. And so, I mean, I think that's actually a more real thing than I think a lot of people say, well, I'm moving to Canada. It's like, yeah, right. Okay.
Right.
I'll see you there.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we've even in terms of the, all the discussion of the political composition of the in-migration to Texas from other states, we've not seen a whole lot of evidence that people are moving for political reasons, economic drivers.
Yeah. Like, can you get a job? Right. Does it pay well? Is it in a cool place? Can you afford housing?
Yeah, and is the place comparably? Yeah, are you,
and the thing is, Texas still has a lot of those places.
Right.
And
so, I mean, but I think, the broader point there that, to go back to the split screen metaphor, tie it all together. I mean, higher education, the debate over higher education, the debates over higher education in this last couple of sessions really have very much illustrated this, and that there's a kind of internal contradiction there. And again, to go back to the idea of an industrial policy, and again, by industrial policy too, I mean, as a term of, as an academic term, that's not just like we're talking about manufacturing. We're talking about, economic strategy led by, state investment of resources to influence the underlying fundamentals of an economy, right? So, to go back to my comparative politics.
Yes.
Right? I know you like that.
I do like.
So, that was that. The split screen on higher ed during the. We talked about this, probably not on the podcast, I don't think, but offline a little bit. It's like, were it not for the politics, which make it kind of comprehensible, if not defensible, one could be forgiven if you just kind of arrived and go, wait, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing here? That's almost too pointed in terms of left and right. So, and then of course the coming trial in the state, the coming trial of Ken Paxton in the Senate continues to fuel speculation, opining on the politics and the process that will shape what the impeached attorney general's fate is going to be. And, I don't feel like there's been an enormous amount of public movement on that.
No, it's a lot of public speculation.
But there's, they are, I'm pretty confident, hard at work on crafting the rules for what that trial is going to look like, which is coming up. And we'll find out about that later this month, at least per the initial announcement by the lieutenant governor. So given all that, but I think the lieutenant or the attorney general being impeached brings us full circle back once again to the unignorable Donald Trump,
right,
and his indictment by special counsel Jack Smith. So we'll open it up a little bit. I mean, big question here in political terms. We can start in Texas, and we've got some national polling over the weekend that we can vector off a little bit. How does this impact views of Trump?
Probably not at all.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No, I think that's kind of that's the answer everybody is struggling with, right? And not struggling because it's so. I think that's the safest, most apparent, and most defensible answer.
Yeah,
but it's the same question we've been asking about this guy since 2015.
Well, and the thing is, and it's not entirely Trump. I mean, I think the thing about it is that we ask the question about Trump repeatedly because he is unignorable and because his conduct makes him a consistent object of just whatever you want to call it, public attention, public fascination, relevance even in the process and the processes that are going on, and ultimately, we've been watching this for a long, and I'd say just to add to this, and the other side of this would say, it's kind of like Joe Biden too. I mean, I wouldn't say that people are necessarily like, there's a lot of things that could happen that are going to necessarily fundamentally shift the electorate's view of Joe Biden. It's sort of one of the sort of facets of politics. I mean, the question just really kind of comes down to your left asking a question that's a lot more narrow, right? Which isn't to say, is the public going to shift? You say, well, does the share of, quote unquote never Trump Republicans, as small as they are, does that share grow? Does the share of Republicans who maybe would lean towards Donald Trump in a Republican primary, but now might consider an alternative? I'm not saying vote for him, just even open up their, does that share grow? And when I say that, I'm not even saying, do we go from, if you look at most national polling, do we go from, a third of the electorate to half? No, it's like, does 20 to 30% grow to 35% is my mind. We're talking about like little
right.
bits. And there's no evidence at this point that anything that he's done is going to change people's views. Because one, these are not new allegations. It's just an aside. Like, this information has been out. The detail is obviously greater, more damning probably than the general stuff. But to a large extent, what we know about people and, the way that
their cognitive habits.
Yeah, cognitive habits, the way that people process information, it's sort of like, it doesn't take much to look at something, oh, that looks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and you just kind of keep going. And there's something to that, which is
still a duck.
Still a duck, right? Which is to say, the process was still messed up, the Justice Department is still weaponized. I was talking about this on Friday, sort of in the wake of the indictment. And, it was pretty easy to say, look, if you kind of look around Twitter as an example, an imperfect example of anything. I'm not saying this is a sample.
Big asterisk,
Not a sample of it, but I think, it gives you a sense of what the currents are. And you had, Democrats producing a lot of memes and stuff, essentially gleeful in this event, which I think is pretty premature. And you've got a lot of Republicans out there kind of following the same path, standard path that they've been following, and including, in fact, with response to Ken Paxton, which is to say the process is messed up. This is political. Ultimately, hey, what about these other guys?
Right. I think and this is where I think we can return to the theme that we've, talked about a little bit before, but, I think that's right. And I think that it's interesting to compare the national dynamics and the response to Trump and all these locked in views and the Texas response to Paxton, because the big there's several differences that are relevant. I don't want to overly reduce this. Trump is obviously much more prominent and and because he's more prominent, probably the attitudes are a bit more baked in.
Yeah, I think so.
And obviously awareness of Trump is, much higher than awareness of the Attorney General, as our polling has shown. But at the same time, one of the big differences is that, the response to the Paxton impeachment and his situation, the math and the calculations among Republicans is much more primary driven, I think, because the competitiveness in the general elections here is just so much lower than at the national level. We were talking about this beforehand. And so the flip side of this is, at the national level, where presidential elections are being decided by, a percent or two. We're looking at a series of 49, 51, 49.5, 50.5.
They get and that percentage gain manifested in a few states.
Right. So it just, it changes the dynamic. And one is that, and I was suggesting this beforehand, and I don't, I think I believe this, that, there could be incremental changes in views of Trump that may not show up in any way that we find reliable in polling, that could actually be significant. And I think that's lurking out there and what makes me suspicious of that is that it's lurking out there as kind of the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
I think. Maybe not quite that elaborated in things
No, the
I've
way
heard,
that people are phrasing that, I think, is the conventional wisdom is like, well, I'm putting my hands on my hips right now.
Right.
So, the indictment might help Trump in the primary because it sort of reinforces this idea that he's under attack by Biden and the Justice Department and an unfair system, and he's the one who's going to stand up to it. And it also makes him the center of attention. And the idea is this sucks the oxygen out of the room. Now, we'll come back to that. But the idea is that's how it helps him in the primary. Let's set that aside. But then in the general election, I mentioned the idea of, does this increase, incrementally sort of Republican skepticism towards Trump? That doesn't mean they're going to vote for a Democrat. Maybe they just don't show up. Maybe they don't support him in a primary. Again, it depends on who the Democratic nominee is, a bunch of stuff. But the other piece of this in elections that are like 49, 51, does this sour him even further among independents? And that's where you've got a problem.
And I think that's I've not, it's a little soon, I think, to rely on any of the polling. There was some fresh polling came out over the weekend that was quality polling. I mean,
and you know
CBS, YouGov,
and
ABC, somebody.
And it kind of looked like all the polling on Trump in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
in the sense was, you could kind of vector this through this particular instance. But when you looked at it, as I recalled one of them about, was this serious? Is it political? Is it both? It's basically about a third. Maybe it's 40-40.
Yeah, that was the YouGov CBS poll. Yeah.
And, and I bet, you break that down by partisanship, you know what that graphic's going to look like.
Yeah.
Right. Independents, I bet, I'd have to go back and I could go back and look, but I can tell you, I'm just going to guess because why not? But I bet the independents were more on the both.
Yeah.
Right. Because everything's screwed up if you're an independent.
Right.
But, having said that, the conventional wisdom is probably not wrong, in the sense that, we haven't had a presidential candidate, under indictment in, potentially 3 states, by the time, he's running for re-election. Is that a great position to be in? And for the true believers, it's fine. It makes no difference, right? And for the sort of the people who are really the core of his base, everything he's telling them is a continuation of the same story. And really what we've seen in the last few weeks is just evidence that he's right.
Yeah.
But if you're someone who's loosely paying attention to this, you can already imagine the campaign ads with the riots. You imagine the campaign ads with the boxes of, state secrets, and it's like, and I mean, and just as sort of like a, we sort of sit here kind of from a weird point of view on this, but you and I were both sort of struck, in the indictment by, and I mean, I'm like, I'll just, give you an honest reaction where, you look at some of these pictures of these boxes, like, stacked up in a bathroom and you kind of like, and there's part of it is like, is this guy okay? Like, I mean, it's just sort of like, the guy can't afford a conference room somewhere, like you can rent these spaces. You can rent, I'm going to tell you something. Florida has a lot of short-term rental spaces.
Well, and I would also say,
yeah,
and it's just, and again, we could,
I'm not trying to make fun of it.
I think it's fair. I mean, it's another thing we could go on, again,
the optics of
the amount of, podcast time, Pixels Inc. spent on trying to like figure out Donald Trump's psychology and cognitive processes, we could be, it's effectively infinite, but no, I mean, I think, I spent, part of the weekend just reading every word of that indictment, and, some of it is just strange.
Yeah.
His own lawyers are on the way, to do the meeting to certify the fact that he's turned over all the he's going to turn over all the documents and that they've seen what's there and they're turning it over, and he's like texting his guys to, go throw the boxes in the bathroom or, in like the, and as I remember the timeline, it's like, the lawyers are probably like driving over while these guys are frantically moving boxes, right? I mean,
boxes of state secrets.
Well, and even, and just to your point about like kind of what goes on, I said, and that's the thing, it's not even like, okay, here's the state secrets box. It's just, all this crap, right? I mean, and look, I've got a ton of this crap, one of those spilled boxes is like newspaper clippings and some files and some photographs and some top secret documents.
No, I mean,
it's just very strange.
My mom was a divorce lawyer for years, which is not a great, if anybody's thinking about getting a divorce law, I would suggest you don't do that. But like, and part of what you do in divorce law, it seems to me, is you basically become an accountant for people. And so it seemed to me that like, throughout much of my life growing up, my mom has just banker's boxes of stuff that you're just kind of moving around because this stuff is gone. And that's kind of what it looked like. It looked like a messy divorce and there's just all this stuff everywhere. And again, just, as someone that, and I'm just like, I'm not saying that anything matters because, it's
in terms of like, changing people's minds and fundamentally shifting.
I think, but ultimately.
Certainly Republican attitudes.
But, but at the same time, the idea that like, you're having, a very kind of clear narrative here about what's been going on with, these top secret documents and you're applying for the job again to be like in charge of the nuclear weapons, it doesn't look great.
Yeah.
And
well, again, I mean, it's funny. We talk, we talk so much.
It also neutralizes a little bit the argument that Biden's senile. I mean, just as an aside. I mean, just, in the sense that you're kind of like, I mean, you can go tit for tat on that at some point when you're looking at the boxes tilting over in the bathroom of all the stuff that he took out of the White House,
Well, there's a broader question there about the candidates that our political system is throwing up.
Throwing up is a...
for leadership. And we, you and I had this discussion during the 2020 primary, but it's worth noting. It's like, okay, these are the two leaders right now, but that's another, conversation perhaps for another time. But I think it does, There's a couple different directions to go here as we get low on time. I think what I would say about this, though, at this point is that also if we want to circle back to Texas and to be as myopic as we can for the moment, it does shift things on the ground here a little bit given the Paxton situation. I mean, one of the things that happened, early in the process of the Paxton impeachment and even, previous was the way that Donald Trump and his allies, not entirely, but largely, I think, as through the agency of the lieutenant governor and, frankly, the attorney general's close relationship with Trump, as at least political relationship.
Right.
I don't think anybody, including the speaker himself, had any illusions that when Donald Trump was criticizing Dade Phelan a few months ago, that was not because Donald Trump gets up thinking about Dade Phelan, the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Right? There is a conduit for that kind of criticism. And, Trump and his allies, criticized the Paxton indictment, the Paxton impeachment.
Right.
That dynamic is different now.
Yeah.
I don't think it's night and day. And look, if anything, we know that the Trump's intervention in these kind of things can seem, slightly at odds with what would seem to be the reality of the situation. But I, it's hard for me to imagine that, the value of Donald Trump sticking up for Ken Paxton, the value proposition there is different now. Now, look, as you said, there will be, at some point, and it's probably already happened and I just haven't seen it, there is a sense of connecting those two in a way that exploits the attitudes you were talking about. Look, they're always going after our guys. Look, they're going after Trump just like they're going after Paxton. They're going after Paxton just like they're going after Trump. But the different piece of that in Texas is that, a lot of Republicans voted to impeach Ken Paxton. And in the same way that there are calculations going on nationally right now among Republicans going, okay, is this the time that that we abandon ship, or do we do the Lindsey Graham and double down? And, Lindsey Graham was on ABC Sunday Show this week, and became kind of, at least for a couple of news cycles being short now, kind of the poster child for, semi-hysterical defense of Trump that is just throwing everything up there. What about Hillary Clinton? What about Joe Biden? What about Hunter Biden? This is not, he is not, this was, I thought, the funniest thing, but it worked, I think, to a certain degree. It's like, there is no evidence that, he committed espionage, and that, the Espionage Act doesn't mean you're meeting a guy in a dark street and handing him documents. It's a whole collection of things that, cover the potential violations of law here.
Well, I think, and you raised sort of two important points here. I mean, one is, the way this process is going to play out is going to, this process, say, including both the Paxton process and Trump's, sort of process going forward, the process is going to play to their advantage. And that's because the legal process is slow. I mean, in the case of Ken Paxton, that's going to go relatively quickly, actually.
Well, I mean, because he's been at it he's actually been deflecting this longer than Trump has.
Exactly. And so the Paxton thing, will go relatively quickly. But even that, there's a lot of time for Paxton to go out and, present his case in the court of public opinion. And when you do that, you're not bound by anything. Right. I mean, so ultimately, you can, so Lindsey, in the case of Trump, Lindsey Graham can go out and say, well, he didn't commit espionage, so this is some BS. And it's like, that has nothing to do with anything here. Right. But it doesn't matter. And that's
just part of the delay, deflect.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And we know that there's an advantage to delaying these things out because all kinds of, in the case of Trump, he could become president and then essentially give himself immunity potentially, or just tell the Justice Department to stop or whatever. Right. But also in the case of, when you're not really trying to fight on the actual charges, which I think is interesting, which is the one very notable similarity in both the case of Paxton and Trump, that nobody is coming to their defense necessarily on the merits and saying, well, no, what he did was fine. I mean, Lindsey Graham is the closest to saying it's fine.
Well, Lindsey Graham was like, he probably made some,
mistakes were made. Right, of course. But then the other side of it is, to what you're saying before, in a situation like this, what I'm watching, and again, because I know public opinion is going to be very slow to move, if it moves at all, But what I think, the point that you're making here is that, politicians are calculated actors, and they are, regardless of what you think of them, they are strategic and they are intelligent about the things that they know about, right? And generally to be someone like a Lindsey Graham, to be a Ron DeSantis, to even to be a Chris Christie, mind you, but also to be, a member in the Texas House of Representatives for, 5 or 6 terms. You have to have some sense of what kind of trade-offs you're making. Yeah. And what's interesting is
how about to be a Senator Nichols or a Senator Schwartner?
Sure.
Just to pick a couple of names out of the hat.
Just pick a couple of names out of the hat, right? You've seen some things, you make some calculations. And the one thing about all of these people, and I'm not saying this is a negative, it's a reality, is like they are transactional for their political careers, right? You don't get that successful if you are not. And so I think, one of the things that you notice is whereas, there's a lot of wait and see going on with Trump. And I think, I read something that described it this way. You essentially have Lindsey Graham as one example who's kind of gone full on. He didn't do anything. You've got kind of the Ron DeSantis approach, which is to say, I'm not really talking about what he did, but the process is all messed up. The Justice Department's a problem, and kind of going on those themes.
Right.
And then you've got the Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinsons of the world who are saying, this is a problem. And what I'm watching is what does the balance of that look like as time goes on? The Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson crowd, does that get bigger? Does it get smaller? Because that gives you a sense of, again, what do elites with a really invested calculation in this process, how do they view it? Now compare that to Texas, where the reality is, if you're saying, I don't want to be mean again, but if you're looking at, so who's lining up behind Paxton outside of Trump and outside of sort of these other vectors, who's lining up behind Paxton? It's a lot of the dissidents, who we kind of started talking about in the McCarthyans. A lot of the people who've been on the outside.
The chair of the Republican Party, the Defend Liberty PAC.
Right. And you said, well, isn't the chair of the Republican Party mainstream? It's like, no, just full stop. No, that's not the mainstream Republican view in Texas. That is a very, the Republican Party of Texas, the platform, the people running that are very much a reflection of the people who show up at primaries and not who show up at primaries, but who, when they say, hey, do you want to come to like the nominating caucus later? They say, yeah, I'll do that. These are some of the most intense partisans that exist. But what's interesting is outside of those guys and gals, right? You come back and you look at the fact that what makes us different in the fundamental way is that, it's majority Republicans in the House that voted to impeach him. Most of the Republicans voted to impeach him. And so to me, that doesn't say like, there's just a natural, this is different than that because of the fact that you can't say, well, these are Democrats on a political witch hunt because that's just factually inaccurate. Right. It's just not, it can't be true.
Although what they're doing is saying that they're connecting it with the argument that the Speaker of the House is too Democrat friendly.
Right. They're closet Democrats, they're rhinos, whatever. Again, we're on the heels of 2 of the most conservative like legislative sessions in Texas history. So that's again just in terms of
there's a pretty good opportunity for a pushback on that.
I mean, from the perspective, and I think the Speaker has done that largely, but from the perspective of a policy output approach, you'd say, well, that's just not again in evidence. So you go back to what I'm saying, which is, these are elites looking at the writing on the wall, looking at the information, making calculations. In the case of Paxton, there's clearly a decision, we need to cut this guy loose, Yeah,
I mean, I think it's, people are being quiet about this to some degree. I mean, the governor's not said much. The lieutenant governor is saying, I've got to be responsible because we're presiding over this. In this environment where negative partisanship is so powerful, and the political system is so, non-competitive at the general election level. I take those as pretty clear signs that people are moving sideways, away from Paxton.
Yeah.
And the decision now that are trying to be made, and certainly the most important decisions are in the construction of these rules in the Senate for the trial, is, how can we do this with the least political damage?
Yeah, and I think if you're a House member, especially I'm talking about a House Republican, you don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. You don't want to be the face of, the Ken Paxton prosecution. But I think, if you kind of basically took a vote for impeachment, you can probably go back to your, to your district and say, hey, look, there's a lot of stuff that went on there, and I think, that's the Senate's job to kind of poke into and figure it out. And they'll, and ultimately it's, we talked about this last week.
The far-right PACs can make all the noise they want on Twitter about how, well, we're going to primary challenge all of them. Everybody that voted, for his impeachment that's a Republican gets a primary challenger. Well, you got enough money to spread that across that many races. Well, you just go right ahead.
Well, yeah, and
I don't think they have the resources to do it.
They don't have the resources.
Even if they could get them, as you're saying, I think if he winds up getting tried and removed by the Senate, it's just, Attorney General Paxton is just a not great candidate to become like the cause celeb for the Republican right.
No, and the thing is, and just even this whole thing, I mean, like, those same groups have been really, really unsuccessful in primary challenging people.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's when they're being much, much more selective in who they choose to primary challenge. And that was at a time, I would say honestly, 3 or 4 sessions ago, when the House and Senate were producing even less conservative legislation than it's producing now. So it's sort of like, okay, fine. But I mean, we've seen this play before, and ultimately these groups have not really, they've not really shown the power that they seem to say that they have.
What I've been saying to
evidence.
people about this in a lot of ways, in the way I think about this, is that you have to, it's helpful, I think, to understand the psychology of most members, and not to cast aspersions, but, there is really no happier elected legislator than one that finds out on the registration deadline day that they don't have a challenger.
Yep. Yeah.
That is like, it's like Christmas. Mm-hmm. And
their staff too.
And so, right. And so if you, so in that way, the odds are a little bit in favor of, these otherwise not largely successful, headhunting expeditions by the far right. They can exploit that fear, because the fear of, the discomfort and the aversion to having a challenger is disproportionate probably to the reality of that happening. But since nobody wants to be contested at all, even if it's a crappy opponent, or, you're going to have a fundraising advantage, they just don't want it.
Yeah, and
why they'll go pretty far to avoid it. But everyone's having to refigure the math, because the Paxton thing is pretty egregious, and the House, they did a good job. The leadership in the House, those that wanted this to happen in the House, did a good job of rallying their troops and wrangling. We're talking offline about McCarthy County. They counted votes pretty well on this.
Yeah, I mean, and then that's the thing. I mean, I think, that's exactly right. But what that does lay out there then very clearly is the fact that, knowing that these guys, more than anything else, want a nice, clean primary in which they're not running against anybody, because the general election is pretty much determined for almost all of the members at this point, especially this close to redistricting. It shows, it makes you wonder about, in an interesting way, the calculation that was made among so many of them to essentially invite a topic that could be the impetus for a primary challenge.
Yeah.
Now, you can look at it one of two ways. I mean, one can be that the thought is, well, Ken Paxton has done so much that once more of this comes out, we can't be associated with this. The other side of it, and I think both of these are in play, is, these dissident groups always say they're going to primary us if we don't do what they want. And you know what? It's not working.
Yeah.
So
the expectations have been discounted, I think. And so, we'll see a little bit. It's going to be a little bit, of time. I kind of suspect that it's going to be interesting to see how much we start hearing about the rules, and it won't be next week, but in the week after that, and as we get closer to the Senate adopting those rules.
I mean, I always say, like, I always joke about expertise in here and stuff, and say how it kind of stinks to be an expert or whatever. But the only thing you can say right now is, well, the rules are going to matter.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's it. And that's all we can say right now until we see what they are. But a lot of, I'm like one of those people, there's a lot of like breathless speculation. Well, they might decide that none of this evidence can count, or what. It's like, they might do anything, but until
we're gonna split hairs on whether the rules will require them to not require some of these members to not be there, whether they will recuse or not. I mean, there'll be time to split those hairs.
Yeah,
later.
we can figure out the meaning of that when it happens. But at this point, anything that's kind of like speculating is just that.
On that, thanks to Josh for being here. Happy birthday again.
Thank you.
Thanks to you're welcome. Thanks to our excellent crew in the audio studio here in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for listening. We'll put this post on the website with some supplemental material, maybe some of this polling we've talked about. And we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.